Hi, my name is Leslie Kendall. I am the chief historian at the Petersen Automotive Museum here in Los Angeles. And welcome to another edition of $1 Million Cars. Now, you may look at this and say there's nothing $1 million about this car, and you would be right. But in its day, this was a $1 million car because when you do the math, this car is one of only 3 ever made. And the guiding force behind it, a lady by the name of Liz Carmichael, had investors spend between $2 and $3 million on this car. So you could easily say that this is a $1 million car. In other words, it would not have existed without the millions of dollars that people put into it. But that's getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Back in the 1970s, and this was built in about 1974, 1975, you have to consider what the automotive landscape was like here in America. Gigantic cars roamed the streets, gas guzzlers were everywhere, and the fuel crisis came down in 1973, halted all the fun. All of a sudden, people weren't spending money on big cars. They had a tremendous yearning for smaller cars. So a woman by the name of Liz Carmichael suggested that she could build a car that would set Detroit on its ear, that would be so much more vehicle for the money that investors would flock to it, people would want to line up to buy one, and it would show Detroit a new way of building cars. Now, the lady's name was Liz Carmichael. And Liz turned out to be Geraldine Michael, who was actually transgender. Now, the Dale is quite an interesting concept, but I wouldn't say that it's especially well developed. It was based on a prototype built by a fellow named Dale Clifft, who Liz Carmichael, Elizabeth G. Carmichael, had met in one of her previous lives, as it were, as a patent consultant. Liz thought that the time was right for a 3-wheel car, a car that would get 70, 80 miles to the gallon, a car that was made of rocket structural resin, a car that had the ability to run into a wall at 30, 40 miles an hour and sustain no damage. And these were very enticing prospects for potential buyers. People loved the idea that, wow, there's a car out here that finally is going to live up to the promise of Detroit. Well, it didn't live up to the promises. Liz ended up taking about $2 to $3 million worth of deposits on the cars and sold dealer franchises and ended up getting in trouble with the Securities and Exchange Commission. She was pursued. She ended up in court and was found guilty on charges of fraud. But a lot of people don't think that Liz really was endeavoring to be fraudulent. A lot of people think, and we kind of agree, the car was something that Liz hoped to make real by sheer force of will. Liz had an awful lot of people working for her, good engineers who knew a thing or two about cars. But when it came to this car, it had to be rushed to the public. Liz made so many wild claims about the car that she had to put it out there. She had to come up with a couple of vehicles that she could get the public's eye with, capture the public attention with. And this was one of them. We believe that this is the car that was in Liz Carmichael's Encino office, the Encino office for 20th Century Motor Car Company, which, if it sounds familiar, that's because it was the automobile company that was mentioned in Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. Liz was an Ayn Rand aficionado. She read everything that Rand wrote, and she was also a student of economics and a student of business. And she claimed that the only reason that this car didn't live up to its promises or wasn't allowed to live up to its promises was because Detroit was out to get her. She thought that Detroit had a vendetta for her. She thought that Detroit knew that the car was so much more vehicle for the money than anything they could possibly produce. And that turned out not really to be true. A lot of people believe that with sufficient development, the car could have been a genuinely workable vehicle. And that has since been proven. There are three-wheel cars out there even today that you can buy in Southern California that have three wheels, one in the back, two in the front, which incidentally is, if you were building a three-wheel car, that's where you would want it. Unfortunately, the center of gravity on the Dale was a little bit high. And so during a test in front of some Japanese investors, potential Japanese investors, the car tilted on its side, scraped the door before coming back down. But this wasn't that car because this is an unpowered prototype. This is a mock-up. It is simply a fiberglass shell with an interior and one opening door. And when you open this door, you really need to be careful because it is only hinged on wood. The framework of the car amounts to 2x4s nailed together. The front wheels aren't even connected, so they have minds of their own. The engine that was touted for the car was not fitted. But when you look at it, you think, well, how could a car be rear engine if it doesn't have any means of cooling? There aren't any cooling vents. Theoretically, you would unlatch this, you could pop up the rear, and you could look at the two-cylinder BMW engine and service it through any BMW motorcycle dealer. The engine turned out to be an Onan two-cylinder generator motor, which was another compromise that Liz had to use to adapt the car to make it realistic, to make it appear realistic to people who might be interested in buying it. Liz fled Los Angeles. She ended up in Texas, still taking deposits on the vehicle. And for her trouble, she was incarcerated. She was let out after several years and lived out her life with her wife and her grandchildren and children. So many people have found Liz's story interesting that there are now multiple documentaries, either online right now or in production. It's a one-of-a-kind idea, a three-of-a-kind car, and a true million-dollar debacle. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure and hit the like button and subscribe.